recording here. So what we're going to look at today is to look at the late classical period. So we're going to look at the late classical period. We'll look at classical and late classical, I should say. And we'll look at some sculpture and some pottery. Let me get rid of that floating bar for you. Okay, so when you look up at the screen, this is an image from the later classical period. This is an image of Hercules, and we think that this is the image of Hercules on the Parthenon, right? What's the major difference between these two portrayals of Hercules? What have you discussed at your table? Catherine, feel free to jump in with another group. No. Okay, what's the major difference between how the god was portrayed? What are some of the major differences? Because there's several. Give me one.
The second image, he's definitely still kind of idealized, but much different. He's not as young, he's not as like athletic, he's just more built than he is like slim.
Right. So he's like got beefier proportions. He's almost like superhero-like or like football-like in a way, right? He's got like bigger muscles. What you mentioned also his age. Notice that his body is still relatively youthful, but you don't see that with his face, right? What does he have on his face that you don't see in classical Greece very often? A beard, right? So almost all of the portrayals of men or gods we've seen have been clean shaven. You do see like Zeus with a beard, that sort of thing, but that was not the typical for the ancient Greeks. What about the emotive quality of it? The emotional quality of it. Is there any big difference here? Sadie? Right. And this one is called the Weary Hercules. It's called the Weary Hercules. It is in the Farnese Palace in Rome. And so they often also call it the Farnese Palace, or Farnese Hercules. And you can see from this example that he's like bigger than life. He is weary from having to do the feats. And so he is actually holding the golden apple in his hand. And he's kind of like tired, right? He's just like exhausted from the feats that he has to have. This one's not in the image set. So that you won't find it. But I like to show you some other pieces so that you can see how we're moving from that classical ideal. And it will make sense when we see all those Hellenistic pieces later today and tomorrow. So this is pretty revolutionary. This is by the artist Praxiteles, and this is an image of the Aphrodite. What do you notice that's revolutionary about her? She's nude. And so in the late classical period, that's the time when we start to see the very first nudes of females. One big difference, the females had to be practical when they came to their nudity, right? It wasn't necessarily about the ideal, it had to deal with the story. Can you tell from the imagery included how this is more appropriate that she's nude? What is she doing? What is this stuff over here? It's her clothes, and that is a hydra. It contains water, and she's probably bathing, right? So this is an Aphrodite image of her bathing. And so this also kind of shows us a little bit about what's going to be developing in the late classical. Notice that she's got contrapposto. However, the S curve, like when we shift our weight, your spine goes into an S curve, right? We start to see that S curve exaggerate in the late classical period. So she becomes much more, like notice that change in her waist and her hips. It's much more of an angle. So we can see some of the differences between classical and late classical, right? So here we see the female body coming through the fabric. Late classical, we might actually just see the body. Doesn't mean clothing goes away. We still have clothing on many female figures, okay? This is Hellenistic, and we'll talk more about Hellenistic tomorrow. So you've probably seen this version of Venus, and you can see that the proportions are even more exaggerated in the Hellenistic. We start moving away from the perfect proportions of Dorpheus, and they start to elongate the figures even more. So they might be like 8 heads tall. And I think that that makes it even more beautiful, more elegant, right? So here we have 2 examples of male sculpture being our classical and then our late classical. Can you see the major difference in this Hermes image? How is this one different than this one? What did we just talk about? We've got even, exactly, more exaggerated contrapposta. And so in the late classical, we have that much more pronounced S curve, much more dramatic poses, exaggerated proportion. So the figures are like 8 heads tall. Another thing that starts to happen is, you know, we've pretty much seen images of like the major gods. We start to see the like more minor gods being portrayed in the sculptures. And then we also have that first female nude being depicted in the late classical period. We don't have any late classical sculpture, but I think it's really a good idea to see the transitional works so that you get a feel for why Hellenistic looks the way it does. So we know a lot of the late classical artists, people wrote about them. Some things were actually signed. So this is Hermes by Praxiteles. And so if you were going to, I'm not going to make you do it again, but if you were to stand up, right, you would see that your S curve gets much more exaggerated. With this image here, Hermes is dangling probably grapes in front of Dionysus, the baby, who is the god of wine, right? So he's like teasing the baby. So sometimes even like sillier sort of stories, more lighthearted stories, okay? Lycosus wrote a treaty, and he's the one that really exaggerated the proportions. This is an image of an athlete, and what he's doing, he's scraping his body and putting olive oil on his skin. So they mentioned in some of the videos we saw that, you know, when they were doing things like the Olympics and some of the other games, they would actually be nude. And so they would be cleaning themselves with olive oil and scraping off all that dirt and dust, right, from working, right? This is a very famous late classical sculpture called the Apollo Belvedere, and it influenced a lot of early American art. So when we think about the birth of our country, you guys see who this is? Who's that? Who's on the right? Anyone recognize it? I've seen it before. It's George Washington. And so these are some of the pieces you don't necessarily see, but images like the Apollo Belvedere really did influence the way we portray early American figures. So there are half nude images of George Washington. This is in Washington, D.C. And then we have other images where he looks much more like he's like either a Roman or he's Greek. And so we'll see examples of Roman busts that look more like this as we go, right? So moving away from late classical sculpture, we're going to look at pottery. And the pottery that we're seeing is really from, like, we already saw geometric pottery. We're going to be looking at like early classical pottery. So this is a little out of chronology, but there are there are 3 techniques that the Greeks are known for, okay? And we mentioned it in the Art 1010 video. Looking at these 2 playing dice, do you guys know what technique this is? This is called black figure pottery, right? So this is black figure pottery here. So your clue obviously is the figures are in black, okay? what they did is they would take and paint the piece in black slip. Okay, they would paint it in, and then they would take a sharp tool and they would carve out the contours. So all the little details of the eyes and the armor and all of that sort of decoration was carved out with a sharp tool. Okay, would you be stressed out that you might make a mistake? I would be too. Then we had the invention of red figure pottery. So black came first, red figure. So basically what they would do is that they would paint in the negative space black, and then all of the detail that we see on this one would be painted in with the slip with a fine brush, right? So you could correct your mistake a little bit easier. So black figure came first, then we have red figure, okay? So you can almost see the carving of this one with Hercules wrestling the Neiman lion. You can kind of see the carving in there. And then in late classical, when you could paint with a brush, a lot of the poses became much more realistic or much more detailed. But remember, this is really the best examples we have of Greek painting is on the pottery, because none of those murals really survived. We do have a Roman recreation that we'll see when we talk about Alexander the Great. So here's a close-up of that black figure. So all of this carved out. All this speckling is caused by the firing process in the film. So similar motifs done in the two different styles. So they used a lot of the same stories, a lot of the imagery throughout hundreds of years. Okay, so you have one piece of pottery in the 250 by the Greeks, and this is the Niobides Krater. We don't know the name of the painter, or at least we're not sure of the name of the painter, because he did all these paintings of the Greek goddess Niobe. They often call her the Niobid Painter. But this is a classical piece. So this is not late classical, it is classical, okay? Okay, so if you have your study guides with you, could you guys go ahead and open up to 21? And I think we're going to go ahead and watch the Smart History. I'm going to have us kind of call off. We've got 1 through 7 on the questions, correct? Yes, they're completely out of order. Can you see that? Can you see how they're completely out of order? So open up to the piece where you have a front and a back view of this piece right there. Can I steal this from you? So can you open up to this page for me in your study guide? So let's go ahead. I want you to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, and then you're going to listen for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so just listen for the answers for your particular, but feel free to fill in the rest as you go. Please notice that it's all out of order. The order in the study guide, number 1 is the first one you'll hear in the video. What it was I had to point arrows to the parts they were talking about. And also something was crazy when I was configuring these study guides, and it wouldn't let me move things very easily. So we're kind of stuck with what it is. Do you guys see how the numbers are all mixed up? Okay. I think I probably have to find a different link. Let's see if this works. Yeah, I didn't think that. That didn't look like the right link. So let me go ahead and open this up. I also noticed that Smart History has a bunch of new Greek videos. I just got an email, so I haven't even watched them. So it'll be interesting to see how much more information we're getting from them. Gotta love Beth and Steve. You're gonna start to feel like Beth and Steve are your like friends. When we did the first test for COVID in May of 2020, they came on and spoke to students when they did those AP, you know, they did like the videos and they would do the daily lessons. They came on the day, the last day to kind of like celebrate with everyone. It was pretty sweet. Okay. Come on. I need to see what the deal is here.
Some figures, different faces are depicted. The gods are shown in purpose profile and the dead people in frontal or three quarters view.
Right. So similar to Egyptians, right? When we see Egyptian people of high rank, they're in profile, frontal profile. It's that like kind of stiff sort of formal one. We see that too, like cool, calm, collected for the Greeks. And then people who are lesser are allowed to be more realistic, right? So 3/4 frontal, laying down, that sort of thing. Number five.
This figure here, both identifiable, both are called the landscape, both the central position on the side of the crater. The figures on the side do not share a single level like their three quarters. This the composition suggests awareness of three qualities, but this study now works.
Right. So all those examples I showed you, they're painted in registers, right? So like around the belly of the piece, there's the story, and you kind of just read it as you look across it. Here, those figures are all over the place, right? So we think that there might be kind of the illusion of depth because things lower in the picture plane, let me actually switch to an image so I can show you that, right? Things lower in a picture plane, we assume are in the front, and things higher in the picture plane, we assume that they're farther away in the back, even though the figures are relatively the same size, right? So 6. You don't have your study guide. Did you get 6? You were 5. Okay, I'll do 6. Some historians have theorized that the central figure is a sculpture. So it's a sculpture that they're paying homage to, right? So the figures surrounded have been, I think yours is a little different than mine, have come to honor the demigod before battle. Although the meaning is uncertain, the scene may be related to the battle of Marathon, which the Greeks defeated the Persians again. Okay, number 6 or 7.
Wax figure towards the bottom of the vase are in contrast to the violent on the other side, reminded of the Greek sleeping.
Very good. So it kind of talks to what we were thinking about yesterday, the idea of order and chaos, right? You see that here as well. Let me get rid of this again, right? So here's a detail where we can see how that fine line work really allowed for the body definition. You can see like elements that you would see in like sculpture, and you see that in the painting as well. Look at the muscle definition in the art. It's like you feel the tendons, right? As he's like reaching down, right? And so for form, right? This is red figure. You know how it was painted. You know the proportions of it from all the stuff we talked about for the Greeks, right? For classical. Patrons and things like that, we don't know it necessarily, but it was used for mixing wine, right, and water. So we have the function of it. Okay, so we're gonna look at some imagery from Hellenistic art. And back in the day when keep comb stuff was really popular, I made this because what you're gonna see is, we saw that kind of transition in story. We're gonna see a big difference between the cool, calm, classical and the much more aggressive, violent, angsty Hellenistic. So we're going to be looking at themes of war and violence, right? The Hellenistic period is really the time of the Romans. This is the time in Greek history between the death of Alexander the Great and the emergence of the Roman Empire in Greece, right? In Greece. So here's an image of Alexander the Great. You probably have heard about him before. He ends up going and taking his armies all the way to the borders in the lands that we now consider India. He actually dies out there, I think in his 30s, if I remember right. He gets sick and dies. But we have coinage of him showing him as a god. There's a lot of pretty realistic images of him, normally showing him with kind of like longer curly hair, and like features that are relatively the same, right? And so we have a mosaic painting or a mosaic, but it's Roman, okay? So I want you to know that we will talk about this again when it comes to the Roman period, but we're going to talk about how it relates to Greek painting today, right? So we think that this is a Roman copy of a Greek painting, right? So we think this is a Roman copy of a Greek painting. This is a mosaic tile floor, or I have to actually remember, it either was on the floor or if it was on the wall of a very nice home in ancient Pompeii. So the volcano covered up this and it allowed for it to be really well preserved. Okay, so we think the Greeks could paint really, really well. And this maybe gives us a little insight into why we think that they were so good. Can you guys just chit chat with each other and talk about why, if this was a painting, why it's pretty revolutionary, maybe comparing it to the pottery? Can you guys go ahead and do that? What's really good about how this was painted? I put painted in quotation because this is not painted. So what makes this a good painting? How is it realistic? Go ahead and chit chat. Okay, so what's so good about this? What do we see that makes it seem pretty realistic? Who can help me out? Go ahead. It's very active. There's an abundance of cast of characters, aren't there? There's just a lot going on. And it's like a climactic moment, right? In a story. What else?
There's like a lot of colors and shading, like very fine detail with it.
Exactly. Unlike the pottery that we saw where everything is flat and then we just have linear detail, it looks like there's some shading. We'll look at some close-ups of that too. How would you compare the proportions of the figures? Yeah.
With the like scale, the one farther back that shows smaller, like this, not only are the people in it, more like look more three-dimensional than the scene itself as well.
Exactly. We have layered space, we have variation in size. We see some things in the front and then things that go back into the back. So there's a much more realistic suggestion of depth, right? And so if we look at it kind of up close, I always use the horse, so I apologize. The horse's rump, it has highlight, mid-tone, and shadow, right? And so we can see they're trying to create the illusion of depth and making things look 3D, right? You can see that in the shading here of Zeus, can't remember. Did you see it in his face too? Right? Look at, there's like worry in his face. You guys see like the worry in his face? Another cool thing, there's this dead or dying Persian right here. And he's kind of like his body is falling. And there's a shield here. And if I look closely, there's a face in it. What do you think the face is? Is it decoration? No, it's probably a reflection of him. Right? So that observation of the real world, if something is shiny, we would see a reflection. So pretty cool, right? Now the Romans were really good painters too. And we have a lot of great examples of Roman painting, especially in Pompeii and Herculaneum. So we'll see some examples of this when we get to the Romans as well. So I'm gonna kind of go back to this. We will talk more about this when we get to the Romans, but here we see Alexander the Great. I can see him in his profile, right? Pretty typical realistic depiction of him. You see him on a rearing horse. He's still cool, calm, and collected because that's the best way to show a ruler, right? Best way to show a ruler is he's got his head together, even though it's a chaotic scene. And comparing him to the Persian leader, and I'm sorry, Darius or Xerxes, can't remember which one. Doesn't he look a little bit more worried? And he's like reaching out, it's like, please save me, right? It's very dramatic. Now, we will look at Indian art. We will look at Buddhist art. We'll look at Hindu art. And this is actually a piece of Buddhist art that we will see a similar piece to when we study it. But since Alexander made his way all the way to India, we actually can see the influence of ancient Greece in Buddhist art. How is this similar to some Greek pieces we've seen? Go ahead and chit chat with each other. How is it similar to some Greek pieces we've seen? Okay. What's Greek about this Buddhist sculpture? Everyone. The wet clean fabric. It's not a female image, it's an image of a man, but it looks like it's got that classical drapery and you see it clinging to his body. Notice how you see his knee pressing through the fabric. You see his belly, you see his shoulder. You see the change in the fabric, right? Because fabric on your shoulder would not wrinkle, right? Because of the gravity. Anything else? Yeah.
I was gonna mention with the knee bend, it looks like there's a bit of contrast.
There is. You got contrapposto, even though it looks kind of stiff. We're missing an arm, makes me think that's probably like this, right? Anything else? I heard something. I think I heard Kara say something about his face.
He is pretty common collecting, which
Right. So the comb face, of course, that makes sense for a guy who meditates a lot too, right? So the next artwork that we're going to start with is looking at Pergamon. Pergamon is in what we think of as Turkey today. So this kind of shows the scope of the Greeks during this time. And what we have is the great altar of Zeus and Athena at Pergamon. I think part of my animation covered up the name here. So let me go ahead and try to fix that. I didn't notice that today. There we go. So you have a plan and you have an image. Let's go ahead and watch this video starting at 6 minutes. And then we can, if we don't get through all of it today, we'll finish it up tomorrow. Come on. Drew, come on. Come on. Asking for my money. More about later. Okay, so from the video that we just started to watch, where is this temple of this, excuse me, this altar to Zeus located? Well, now it's in Berlin, but it was in Pergamon, but what place in the city? Where do we put temples? Near the center, on a hill. So this plan that you have here is on the Acropolis in Pergamon. So there's multiple acropoli, right? Acropolis. This is doesn't sound right. So every major city would have an acropolis, and it would be placed on a sacred hill. And so this, you don't have necessarily the temple, but you have the plan. And so we can see where it was. We can see how it was in relationship to other structures. They talked about how there was a garrison for soldiers, like the protective forces. There's the palace. There's a Greek theater in the hillside. Yeah.
We don't have them.
You don't have the plan? Is it on a separate page? No? Darn it. I didn't catch that. This is probably a page either I didn't make or I didn't connect it. Right? So looking at where it's located, I apologize. Maybe we can print an extra of it. You can see how it was strategically located near the agora. And then the agora would be the market, right? So it would be in a central location in the city on the hilltop. You can see all the other parts of it as well. There'd be other temples to like Athena and Zeus on this hillside. Okay. And then the temple itself, this is probably what you have in the image set, correct? Right? So we know who this altar is dedicated to in the name. So it's an altar of Zeus and Athena. There are separate temples for those two gods on the Acropolis. Okay, and so in this Berlin museum, they've recreated the temple. It didn't really last. All of the pieces that we have, you know, there's parts of it that have been added to it, but it really is just a recreation of what it once was. And so there was a set of stairs that led you into basically an open courtyard that would have a ceremonial fire. And that's pretty Roman and Greek. So remember that most Greek religious functions happened at a ceremonial fire rather than inside the temple itself. And Romans tended to have a set of stairs leading into the temple. So we can start to see some of maybe that influence, or maybe this is something that influenced the Romans to do that as well. Okay, so the function of it was dedicated to Zeus and giving offerings to Zeus as well as Athena. I didn't write Athena up there. Okay, so dedicated giving offerings to both of those gods, which of course would be warrior gods, right? Unlike the God of all gods. Okay, and so the illustrations, what are the stories on it? This would be your content, right? Your content. The imagery is all based on the gods versus the giants, right? So all of the Mount Olympus gods. And so in your close-up, so the picture that they've included in the 250, we have Athena battling Achilles. And so Achilles is battling, he's right there. And then this person down here is his poor mother. This giant, right? His poor giant mother is forced to notice her pulling his hair, right? Notice the agony in his face, right? In Hellenistic sculpture, it is drama, 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 right? Drama in poses, drama in facial expressions, kind of a way is that cool, calm, and collected that we saw in the classical. Hence, my be calm, be classical, not Hellenistic. And then basically what we have is these Nike figures in the background. So you can see how they're in much more shallow relief. So this is just one element of the battle. So tomorrow we'll focus on the stylistic things and then finish up with this one. And then we'll look at some of our other Hellenistic pieces.